In a modest house in Louisville, Kentucky, there is a bedroom that time seemingly forgot. Stuffed animals sit undisturbed on the shelves, gathering the dust of 42 long years. A pair of small pink sneakers remains parked by the door, waiting for feet that have long since outgrown them. For more than 4 decades, a father lived within this quiet stillness, refusing to change a single object, holding on to the fragile promise that his daughter was still alive. This is not a story of strangers lurking in the night or a random act of violence. This is a mystery that began in broad daylight, where a mother and her young child simply evaporated from the face of the earth, leaving behind a silence that would baffle investigators for half a century. How does a woman successfully erase her entire identity and build a completely new life right under the nose of the federal government? And what happens when a 42-year-old lie is finally exposed by the most fragile of clues? Before we peel back the layers of this unprecedented cold case, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to bring these forgotten files back into the light. Now, to understand the sheer weight of that long silence, we must go back to where it all began. To the very day the clock stopped. To understand the gravity of the disappearance that took place in the spring of 1983, one must first understand the era in which it occurred. It was a time before the digital tether of smartphones and social media, a period when a person could drive across state lines and effectively vanish from the public record. In the blue-collar neighborhoods of Louisville, Kentucky, life moved at a steady, predictable rhythm. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, and pop culture was dominated by upbeat rhythms. Yet for one family, this particular spring would mark the beginning of a silence that would last for more than 4 decades. The story begins with a single, haunting photograph that would eventually become the face of a mystery stretching across generations. The image captures a young girl, a toddler, dressed in a crisp white sailor dress. She has dark hair, styled in pigtails, and is smiling with the innocent gap between her 2 front baby teeth. Her name was Michelle Marie Newton, known affectionately as Shelley to those who loved her. Friends and neighbors described her as a bright and curious child, always ready with a hug, who cherished her stuffed animals and loved riding on her father's shoulders during neighborhood walks. Her father, Joseph Newton, known to everyone as Joe, was 33 years old at the time. He was a hard-working man with a steady job and a deep devotion to his young family. He and his wife, Deborah Lee Newton, had been married for several years, and to the outside world, their domestic life appeared ordinary. However, the Newtons were planning a significant change that spring. Joe had secured an opportunity for better employment in Georgia. The prospect of warmer weather and a lower cost of living seemed like a fresh start for the 3 of them. According to retrospective interviews and police files, Deborah appeared excited about the move. The plan was logistical and seemingly sound. Deborah would travel to Georgia first to scout for apartments, set up the new residence, and ensure everything was ready for a smooth transition. Joe would stay behind in Louisville for a short period to wrap up loose ends, give notice at his current job, and handle the sale of their house. It was a divide-and-conquer strategy common among relocating families, requiring a high degree of trust and coordination. On the morning of April 2nd, 1983, the plan was put into motion. Deborah packed a suitcase and bundled their young daughter into the family car, a modest sedan with Kentucky license plates. There was no scene of conflict, no dramatic argument that neighbors could later recall. Deborah kissed Joe goodbye and promised to call him as soon as they were settled in the new location. In statements Joe later provided to law enforcement, he recalled Deborah's parting words, "We'll be waiting for you." It was a promise of continuity, an assurance that this separation was merely a pause in their shared life. As the car pulled away, the little girl waved from her car seat, still wearing her favorite outfit, oblivious to the fact that this wave would be the final image her father would hold of her for over 40 years. From an investigative standpoint, this moment is critical to analyze because of what experts call situational trust. At that specific instant, Joe Newton had no reason to suspect that a crime was unfolding. There were no strangers lurking in the shadows, no forced entry, and no violence. This was a departure that happened in broad daylight, orchestrated by a spouse. It highlights the unique complexity of parental abduction cases. The perpetrator is not a faceless villain, but a central figure in the family unit. Joe remained in Louisville to tie up the everyday details of uprooting a life, fully expecting a phone call that evening or perhaps the next day. He anticipated a quick check-in to confirm they had arrived safely, perhaps a comment about the size of the new apartment or the traffic on the interstate. He waited for the phone to ring, but the call never came. As the hours turned into days, the silence began to shift from a minor annoyance to a profound source of dread. Joe attempted to call the number Deborah had left for a potential rental property in Clayton County, Georgia. There was no answer. He tried again. Still nothing. There was no forwarding information. No way to trace the call in a world that had not yet developed caller identification or GPS tracking. The psychological toll of this initial silence is difficult to overstate. In 1983, if a person did not answer a landline, they were simply unreachable. Joe began reaching out to friends and relatives in the area, asking if anyone had seen Deborah's car. No one had. The dread deepened. What Joe did not yet know was that his wife and daughter had not merely been delayed. They had exited his life completely. This marks the beginning of what investigators often refer to as the long silence. It is a period where the left-behind parent grapples with confusion, often making excuses for the missing spouse. Car trouble, a medical emergency, a lost address book, before allowing themselves to consider the darker possibility that they have been deceived. For Joe Newton, the innocent wave from the back seat on April 2nd was not just a goodbye. It was the closing of a chapter and the beginning of a 4-decade mystery that would baffle detectives and leave a father waiting in a house full of memories. The disappearance was total, and as we will see, it was executed with a precision that suggests it may have been more than a spontaneous decision. The immediate aftermath of a disappearance is rarely marked by sudden realization. Rather, it is characterized by a slow, creeping erosion of normalcy. For Joe Newton, the days following April 2nd, 1983, were defined not by what happened, but by what did not. He remained in Louisville, inhabiting a house that had suddenly become quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was supposed to be packed up and moved south. His role was to finalize the sale of the property and resign from his job, tasks that required focus, yet his attention was entirely captured by the silent telephone in the hallway. According to police files and later interviews, Joe expected a call on the evening of the departure, or perhaps the following morning. It was a reasonable expectation in an era where long-distance travel was wearying, and a safe arrival call was standard protocol for families separated by state lines. He anticipated a brief check-in, a confirmation that the drive down Interstate 75 had gone smoothly and that his wife and daughter were settling into the rental apartment they had discussed. But as the sun set on the first day and rose on the second, the phone did not ring. In the context of missing person cases, psychologists often refer to this period as the normalization phase. The human mind, when faced with a disrupting event, instinctively attempts to fit it into a rational framework to avoid panic. Joe likely reasoned that the move was chaotic, that the connection in the new apartment had not yet been established, or that they were simply too exhausted from the journey to find a payphone. However, as days turned into a full week, the silence shifted from a logistical annoyance to a source of profound alarm. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Joe attempted to take proactive measures. He dialed the contact number Deborah had provided for the potential rental property in Clayton County, Georgia. This number was his only digital tether to his family. The result was a vacuum of information. There was no answer, and crucially, there was no forwarding information available. In the early 1980s, without the internet to verify addresses or reverse lookup phone numbers, A deadline was a formidable wall. The investigation reveals that Joe did not stop at the phone line. He began reaching out to their social circle, calling friends and relatives in both Kentucky and Georgia. He asked the same repetitive questions. Had anyone seen Deborah's car? Had anyone heard from them? The sedan, with its Kentucky plates, seemed to have evaporated the moment it crossed the state line. No one had seen the vehicle, and no one had received any communication from Deborah. Confronted with this inexplicable void, Joe made the decision to physically retrace the route his family was supposed to have taken. He traveled to Georgia himself, driven by the desperate hope that perhaps he would find them at the destination, dealing with some mundane crisis that had prevented a phone call. He arrived in Clayton County and began the analog work of a search, knocking on doors of apartment complexes and showing photographs to strangers. This phase of the story highlights the terrifying isolation of a pre-digital search. Joe stood on foreign ground, holding a picture of his daughter and wife, appealing to the memory of leasing agents and passers-by. The response was a uniform negative. There was no lease under the name Deborah Lee Newton. There were no utility connections requested in her name. The physical trace of his family was non-existent. It was during this trip that the denial finally broke. Joe realized that they had never arrived at the intended destination. The plan had been a fabrication, or something catastrophic had intervened. Upon his return to Louisville, Joe contacted local law enforcement. But the response he received illustrates a systemic issue prevalent in that era. Initial police reports indicate that officers treated the disappearance as a domestic matter rather than a criminal one. In the legal and cultural climate of the early 1980s, if a parent left with their own daughter, it was frequently interpreted as a marital disagreement or a temporary separation. Authorities suggested to Joe that perhaps his wife needed a cooling-off period and would return when emotions settle. This classification, labeling the event as a civil dispute rather than a potential abduction, created a critical delay in the investigative process. Valuable time was lost as the case languished in the gray area between family court and criminal investigation. While Joe knew with certainty that his wife would not simply vanish without a word, especially not with their daughter, the system required proof of malicious intent that, at that early stage, did not yet exist. This administrative hesitation allowed the trail to grow cold before a formal search could even begin. The long silence that started with a missed phone call was now being compounded by a lack of official urgency. For Joe Newton, the realization was stark. He was the only one actively looking for his daughter, and the head start his wife had secured was widening with every passing hour. The domestic classification of the case would eventually be overturned, but the initial inaction during those first critical weeks would have consequences that rippled through the next 42 years. The transition from a domestic misunderstanding to a formal criminal investigation is often a slow, bureaucratic process, particularly in the landscape of law enforcement during the early 1980s. For Joe Newton, the weeks following the departure of his family were defined by a desperate struggle to legitimize his concern in the eyes of the authorities. The initial classification of the disappearance as a civil disagreement meant that, legally speaking, no crime had occurred. A mother traveling with her daughter was not inherently suspicious, and without evidence of foul play or a custody order prohibiting travel, police hands were largely tied. However, as the calendar turned from April to May, the sustained silence began to erode the cooling-off theory that officers had initially suggested. Parental abductions, while not uncommon, usually followed a pattern of brief contact or negotiation. The total absence of communication in this case defied the standard profile of a marital spat. Joe's persistence was the catalyst that finally shifted the inertia of the system. He argued that a planned relocation involves logistics, leases, utilities, job transfers, none of which had materialized in Georgia. His argument was logical and undeniable. People do not simply evaporate if they intend to start a new life. They leave a paper trail. By late spring, the tone of the inquiry shifted fundamentally. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office officially reclassified the file, opening a formal missing persons investigation. This administrative change was pivotal. It granted detectives the authority to expand their reach beyond the local jurisdiction and allowed for the allocation of resources that a civil case would never receive. The names Deborah Lee Newton and Michelle Marie Newton were entered into the record, not as travelers, but as subjects of an active search. The investigation faced immediate logistical hurdles distinct to the era. Without a centralized digital database or the instant connectivity of the modern internet, the dissemination of information was a labor-intensive, physical process. Detectives and family members had to rely on the creation and distribution of paper bulletins. These flyers, printed in black and white, bore the grainy images of the mother and daughter, accompanied by a description that was heartbreakingly ordinary. A family unit last seen departing for a scheduled move. These bulletins were manually posted in high-traffic areas along the projected travel route. Truck stops, post offices, and community centers across Kentucky, and stretching down the Interstate 75 corridor into Georgia became the primary billboards for the case. The strategy was to cast a wide net, hoping that a gas station attendant, a diner waitress, or a motel clerk might recall the vehicle or the faces. It was a search method that relied entirely on human memory and the chance observation of strangers. Joe cooperated fully with this new phase of the investigation, providing detectives with every granular detail he could recall. He mapped out the intended route, the specific conversations about the apartment complex in Clayton County, and the timeline of their departure. His willingness to share information was crucial, as it allowed investigators to build a timeline of the last known movements, a foundational element in any missing persons case. From an analytical perspective, this phase of the case highlights the immense difficulty of tracking individuals who wish to remain unseen in a pre-surveillance society. In 1983, a person could change their name, pay in cash, and effectively sever their history by simply crossing a state line. The system was fragmented. A sheriff's office in Georgia had no automatic way of knowing that a sheriff's office in Kentucky was looking for a specific sedan unless a physical bulletin crossed their desk. The issuance of the missing persons report also marked a psychological turning point for the father. It was an official validation of his fear. His family was not just away, they were gone. The narrative of the case had transformed from a story of a relocation gone wrong to a story of a fugitive mother and a daughter taken from her home environment. The search was no longer about waiting for a phone call. It was about hunting for clues in a landscape that offered very few. The physical flyers that began to appear on bulletin boards were the only tether connecting Michelle and Deborah to their former life. Paper ghosts haunting the highways of the American South. By the winter of 1984, the initial momentum of the investigation had begun to wane. In the world of missing persons cases, time is the greatest adversary. As days turn into months, the urgency of the public fades, and the police file inevitably moves further down the stack. For Joe Newton, the daily reality had shifted from acute panic to a grueling, chronic uncertainty. He had exhausted his immediate leads, knocked on doors in Georgia, and distributed flyers across state lines. Yet the silence remained unbroken. The trail had not just gone cold, it appeared to have evaporated entirely. Then, in a moment that would stand as the single most baffling event of the entire 42-year saga, the silence was briefly and inexplicably shattered. Sometime between late 1984 and early 1985, the exact date remains ambiguous in the surviving recollections. The telephone in Joe's Louisville home rang. When Joe lifted the receiver, he did not hear a wrong number or a telemarketer. He heard the voice of his wife, Deborah. This communication, which would prove to be the final contact between the couple for more than 4 decades, was described in later police summaries as brief and tense. It was not a conversation in the traditional sense, with an exchange of information or emotional reconciliation. Instead, it was a unilateral transmission. According to the case files, Deborah offered no explanation for her departure or her prolonged silence. There was no apology, no detailed account of where they were living, and crucially, no indication of when or if they would return. She did not disclose her location, and in an era long before caller identification or instant star 69 tracing capabilities, the origin of the call was a mystery. She spoke only a few words, enough to confirm her identity and her conscious decision to remain absent before the line went dead. The significance of this singular phone call cannot be overstated from an investigative or psychological perspective. For law enforcement, it served as definitive proof of life. It confirmed that Deborah and the child were alive, and that the disappearance was a voluntary act of evasion rather than the result of an external tragedy or accident. However, instead of providing a lead, the call paradoxically deepened the mystery. By refusing to offer a location, Deborah transformed the case from a potential rescue mission into a complex pursuit of a fugitive who was actively taking steps to avoid detection. For the father, this brief contact was a psychological blow. The abrupt termination of the call, the literal dial tone following the sound of his wife's voice, represented a second departure. It was the final thread anyone could grasp. And when the line went dead, it severed the last tangible connection to his previous life. After that moment, there were no more calls, no postcards, and no whispered sightings in small towns. Analysts reviewing the behavior of abducting parents often point to such communications as complex maneuvers of control, or perhaps fleeting moments of guilt. By making contact, the taking parent asserts their dominance over the situation, proving they have the power to speak or remain silent at will. Conversely, it may have been a singular impulse to reassure the father that the child was safe, albeit hidden. Regardless of the motivation, the result was a devastating finality. The investigation hit a wall following this transmission. Without a trace on the call, detectives were left with nothing but the knowledge that the subjects were out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the United States. The trail evaporated completely after the winter of 1985. The final transmission became a demarcation line in the case history. Everything before it was the immediate search. Everything after it became the long, quiet wait of a cold case. The phone would not ring with news of them again for nearly half a century. By the summer of 1985, the silence surrounding the Newton case had transformed from a local mystery into a matter of federal urgency. The initial hope for a misunderstanding or a temporary separation had completely eroded, replaced by the stark realization that this was a calculated disappearance. In response, the legal system began to mobilize with a severity that reflected the duration of the absence. In a significant procedural escalation, a Jefferson County grand jury convened to review the evidence. The result was a formal indictment against Deborah Lee Newton on charges of custodial interference. Under Kentucky state law, this was not a minor infraction. It was classified as a felony. Crucially, for cases involving parental abduction, where the subject is taken across state lines, the law provided a powerful tool. There was no statute of limitations. This legal permanence meant that no matter how much time passed, whether 5 years or 40, the warrant would remain active, waiting for a mistake or a moment of discovery. The escalation did not stop at the state level. Recognizing the likelihood that Deborah had crossed jurisdictional boundaries, the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. The Bureau issued a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, a designation that allows federal resources to be deployed in the hunt for a fugitive wanted on state charges. This move signaled a shift in the status of the investigation. It was no longer just a search for a missing family, but a manhunt for a wanted individual. For a brief but intense window in the late 1980s, the case reached its zenith in terms of public visibility. Deborah Lee Newton was placed on the FBI's list of the top 8 most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives. This was a rare and distinguishing classification, one that elevated her profile far above the thousands of other missing person reports filed annually. Her face, alongside the image of her daughter, appeared on posters in federal buildings and post offices nationwide. The objective was to make the faces ubiquitous, to turn every citizen into a potential witness. This high-level exposure generated a surge of activity. Tips began to pour in from across the country, driven by the national spotlight. Investigators chased leads that placed a woman matching Deborah's description in Atlanta and others that suggested she was hiding in Florida. Each tip required resources, time, and hope to investigate. Detectives and agents conducted interviews, surveilled locations, and ran down license plate numbers. However, the result was a maddening repetition of false alarms. Each potential sighting checked out negative. The woman in the diner was not her. The new neighbor in the suburbs was just a stranger. To combat the passage of time, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children utilized forensic artists to create age-progressed sketches of the daughter. These images were an attempt to bridge the gap between the toddler seen in the 1983 photographs and the growing child she was becoming. The sketches depicted a girl who might have grown into a teenager, possessing her mother's eyes and her father's smile. These forensic projections were circulated widely, serving as a haunting reminder that while the search was static, the subject was changing, growing, and aging in secret. Despite the federal warrants, the national posters, and the age progression technology, the case eventually fell victim to what experts call investigative fatigue. As the years rolled on without a confirmed sighting, the leads dried up. The spotlight of the media and the Bureau inevitably shifted to newer, more violent, or more immediate crimes. The top 8 list was updated, and Deborah's name was eventually removed. From an analytical standpoint, this chapter of the investigation underscores the limitations of law enforcement in a pre-digital era. Without electronic financial trails or cell phone pings, a fugitive who committed to a life of cash and silence could effectively disappear. The removal of Deborah from the priority list was not an admission of defeat, but a bureaucratic necessity of resource allocation. The trail had evaporated. The active pursuit slowed, leaving the file to gather dust in a metal cabinet, waiting for a breakthrough that would not come for another generation. The legal framework remained in place, the felony warrant active but dormant, acting as a silent trap set for a future that was still decades away. While the federal investigation expanded outward, chasing leads across state lines and circulating bulletins in post offices nationwide, a far quieter and more profound narrative was unfolding inside a modest home in Louisville, Kentucky. This chapter shifts the focus from the procedural mechanics of the manhunt to the static, enduring vigil of the father, Joseph Newton. For the world outside, the case of the missing mother and daughter eventually faded into the background noise of the 1980s. But for Joe, time effectively stopped on the day of their departure. The most visceral symbol of this suspended reality was the daughter's bedroom. According to family accounts and media reports from the era, Joe made a conscious decision in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. He would not change a single thing. He kept the room exactly as it had been left on that spring morning in 1983. The crib remained assembled in the corner. Stuffed animals were lined up on the dresser, gathering dust, but never moved. A small pair of pink sneakers remained parked by the door, waiting for feet that were growing larger somewhere far away. Psychologists and grief experts often refer to this behavior as a response to ambiguous loss. Unlike a confirmed passing, where a family can hold a funeral and begin the process of mourning, a missing person case offers no such closure. There is no body, no finality, and therefore no permission to move on. For Joe, dismantling the room would have been an admission that they were never coming back. Keeping it preserved was an act of defiance against the silence. It was a physical manifestation of the belief that the door might open at any moment, and his daughter would need her sanctuary. In a rare and emotional interview with a local television station in 1986, 3 years after the disappearance, Joe allowed a camera crew to glimpse this suspended life. His demeanor on camera was described as soft-spoken, but visibly fractured. He looked directly into the lens, addressing an audience that might unknowingly hold the key to his family's location. His words, preserved in the archives, were simple yet devastating. Wouldn't you want your child back? At least to see her grow up, to know she's safe. This broadcast highlighted the unique torture of the left-behind parent. Joe was not seeking revenge or even justice in the punitive sense. His primary objective was assurance. He told reporters repeatedly, "I just want to know she's okay. I don't care about anything else." This sentiment is common in long-term non-family abduction cases. But in parental abduction scenarios, the complexity is heightened. The searching parent knows the abductor. They once shared a life with them, which adds layers of betrayal and confusion to the grief. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, and the case slipped entirely from the headlines, Joe's life remained anchored to that house in Louisville. He never remarried. He did not sell the property, even as the neighborhood around him changed and evolved. To move would be to sever the last geographic link to his daughter. If she ever tried to find her way home, he needed to be there to answer the door. Analysts, looking back on this period of the long wait, note the extraordinary emotional stamina required to maintain such a vigil. For 42 years, Joe Newton lived in the company of ghosts, memories of a wife who deceived him and a daughter he was missing. The silence in the house, as described in later retrospectives, was louder than any scream. It was a silence filled with unanswered questions. Was she happy? Did she remember him? Was she safe? The room, frozen in time, became more than just a shrine to a missing child. It became a testament to a father's refusal to be erased from his daughter's narrative. While the administrative files were eventually archived and the detectives rotated onto new cases, the father's investigation never truly closed. He kept the light on, physically and metaphorically, ensuring that if the day of return ever arrived, the past would be waiting to welcome the present. This unwavering permanence stood in stark contrast to the fluid, shifting identity of the mother, who was busy constructing a new reality hundreds of miles away. While Joe Newton maintained his solitary vigil in Louisville, a parallel narrative was being constructed hundreds of miles away, built entirely on fabrication and silence. To understand how a woman and a young child could vanish for more than 4 decades, one must examine the mechanics of identity theft in the pre-digital age. This chapter explores the hypothetical yet highly probable steps taken by Deborah Lee Newton to erase her past and invent the woman who would eventually be known as Sharon Neely. In the spring of 1983, the infrastructure of surveillance that defines modern life, digital banking, license plate readers, facial recognition, and the internet did not exist. This lack of connectivity created vast blind spots in the national record, spaces where a person determined to disappear could slip through unnoticed. Investigators believe that Deborah leveraged this analog anonymity to shed her former self the moment she crossed the state line. The Kentucky sedan likely vanished into a secondary market or was abandoned, and with it, the name Deborah Newton ceased to be used in any official capacity. Somewhere in the transition between Kentucky and the Deep South, Deborah began the meticulous process of constructing a new persona. She adopted the alias Sharon Neely, a name that would appear on leases, utility bills, and eventually, property deeds. To support this fiction, she utilized a fabricated date of birth, October 15, 1960, altering her actual birth year of 1959, just enough to confuse any potential record search while remaining plausible. This slight adjustment is a common tactic in identity fraud, creating a ghost that exists adjacent to reality but cannot be easily cross-referenced against original birth certificates. The transformation was not limited to the mother. The daughter, Michelle, was given a new name as well, Alexis Marie Carter. This was perhaps the most critical and irreversible component of the disappearance. By renaming the child, Deborah effectively severed the girl's link to the missing persons bulletins circulating in post offices. The name Michelle Newton became a relic of the past, while Alexis Carter began to build a documented history, school records, medical files, and eventually employment history that appeared entirely legitimate to the outside world. But a new name requires a new history. To explain the absence of a father and the lack of extended family, Deborah constructed a foundational lie that would shield them from scrutiny. According to statements later provided by the daughter, she was told from the earliest days of her memory that her father had passed away when she was an infant. This narrative of widowhood was a powerful defensive tool. It elicited sympathy rather than suspicion and effectively shut down any inquiries about paternal relatives. The daughter grew up believing that their isolation was a result of tragedy, not a choice to evade the law. The life they built was designed to be unremarkable. They moved frequently during the early years, preventing deep roots from forming that might lead to accidental exposure. Eventually, they settled into a quiet rhythm. Sharon Neely became a woman who paid her taxes on time, avoided debt, and kept to herself. She did not stand out. In later years, she would purchase a modest villa in a retirement community, pay her bills, and walk her dog, projecting the perfect image of a retired woman living a peaceful life. From an analytical perspective, this art of disappearing requires an immense psychological toll. Living under an assumed identity means never fully relaxing. Every knock at the door, every official form, and every new acquaintance represents a potential threat to the carefully constructed reality. Criminologists note that fugitives who successfully evade capture for decades often do so by becoming hyper-normal. They avoid crime, they avoid conflict, and they blend so seamlessly into the fabric of their community that they become invisible. For the daughter, now living as Alexis, the deception was total. She attended school, graduated, and built a career as a veterinary technician, never knowing that her entire identity was a fabrication rooted in a felony. She had no criminal history and no reason to doubt the woman she called Mom. The success of Deborah's disappearance lay not just in the logistics of fake names, but in the emotional manipulation of the one person who could have exposed her. By controlling the narrative of the dead father, Deborah ensured that her daughter would never look for the man who was, in reality, sitting in a house in Louisville, waiting for a phone call that would not come for 42 years. As the calendar turned from the 1990s to the new millennium, the urgency that had once defined the search for the Newton family began to dissipate, replaced by the slow, grinding erosion of bureaucracy. While the 1980s had been characterized by active leads, federal warrants, and media broadcasts, the new era brought a different kind of challenge: the quiet, administrative dismantling of the case itself. This chapter examines how procedural technicalities and policy shifts can inadvertently conspire to erase a missing person from the public record, not through malice, but through the sheer passage of time. The first significant blow to the legal framework of the investigation arrived in the year 2000. For 15 years, the 1985 indictment against Deborah Lee Newton for custodial interference had stood as a legal placeholder, a dormant charge waiting to be activated upon her location. However, in a move that stunned those few still watching the case, the Jefferson County Commonwealth's Attorney's Office moved to dismiss the indictment. The dismissal was filed without prejudice, a legal term indicating that the state reserved the right to refile the charges at a later date should new evidence arise or the suspect be located. However, the immediate effect was the cancellation of the active warrant. The reasoning provided by the prosecutors was technical rather than evidentiary. According to court records, the state asserted that they could not locate the complaining witness, Joseph Newton, to testify at a potential trial. This administrative failure highlights a critical vulnerability in the justice system of that era. Joe Newton had not vanished. He had simply changed addresses and employment over the years, navigating the natural progression of a life lived in limbo. In a world before interconnected digital databases, his failure to manually update his contact information with a specific court clerk meant that, in the eyes of the legal system, he was unreachable. The dismissal was not an exoneration of the mother. It was a paperwork casualty, a decision driven by the logic that a case cannot be prosecuted without a witness. Legal analysts, reviewing this turn of events, point to the tragedy of bureaucratic disconnection. The father was sitting in a house in Louisville, still waiting for his daughter, while a few miles away, a judge was signing an order that effectively declared the search for justice inactive. The system had lost the victim's advocate, and consequently, it dropped the pursuit of the suspect. 5 years later, in 2005, a second and perhaps more emotional erasure occurred. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the non-profit organization that had been instrumental in circulating the age progressed, images of Michelle, updated its case files. Under the policies in place at that time, cases could be archived if no credible leads had surfaced in a significant number of years and there was no specific evidence of foul play. Consequently, Michelle Marie Newton's name was quietly removed from the active public-facing database to the casual observer browsing the website. She simply ceased to exist. The removal carried a heavy, unspoken implication. The system presumed the subject was either safe under a new identity, having grown into adulthood, or was no longer alive. The missing child designation was administratively retired, not because she was found, but because she had been missing for too long. The impact of this decision on the father was profound. Joe did not receive a formal notification letter or a phone call explaining the policy change. Instead, he discovered the removal months later when he proactively contacted the organization to check on the status of the latest age progression photo. A representative gently explained that the file had been archived. In a conversation with a family member, Joe later described this moment as a second loss. "They took her off the list like she never existed," he reportedly told a cousin. This sentiment encapsulates the unique pain of administrative erasure. For the institution, archiving a cold file is a necessary step in resource management, allowing focus to shift to active, urgent cases. For the family, however, it feels like a public declaration that their loved one is no longer worth looking for. From a sociological perspective, this chapter demonstrates the stark difference between a case being solved and a case being closed. The dismissal of the indictment and the archiving of the profile did not change the reality that a daughter was missing and a father was searching. It merely meant that the institutions designed to assist in that search had stepped back. The safety net had been retracted. By the mid-2000s, Michelle Newton was no longer a fugitive's daughter in the eyes of the state or the nonprofit sector. She was a ghost, remembered only by the man who refused to clear the stuffed animals from her bedroom shelves. The official mechanisms had stopped turning, leaving the resolution of the mystery entirely to chance and the persistence of memory. By late 2015, the administrative dormancy that had defined the previous decade of the investigation was about to be shattered by the most fragile of investigative tools: human memory. For years, the file concerning the disappearance of the Newton family had been relegated to annual audits, a procedural formality where detectives checked for new activity on Social Security numbers or credit reports. These digital queries consistently returned blank results, reinforcing the theory that Deborah Lee Newton had successfully severed all ties to her former identity. However, the breakthrough that reignited the case did not come from a database. It arrived via a phone call to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office from a distant relative of the mother. This individual, who had maintained sporadic contact with the extended family, had recently watched a news segment regarding a woman arrested in Tennessee for a completely unrelated parental abduction. The broadcast acted as a psychological trigger, unearthing a dormant recollection from the years preceding the disappearance. The relative recounted a specific conversation with Deborah, a casual remark made decades earlier that had seemed insignificant at the time. According to the police report, Deborah had once mused that if she ever needed to disappear, she would choose a location that was warm, quiet, and populated with palm trees. She had specifically mentioned Florida as a potential sanctuary. While the tip was thin and lacked a specific address or alias, it provided a geographic focus that had been missing for 32 years. This seemingly minor lead landed on the desk of Detective Mark Harlan. Harlan was a veteran investigator who had transitioned to the cold case unit after a career in homicide. His approach to the file was characterized by a philosophy often cited by successful cold case detectives: The belief that every investigation deserves a fresh set of eyes every decade, regardless of how hopeless it appears on paper. He did not view the palm tree tip as a solution, but as a justification to pull the physical file from the archives and restart the clock. The first step in this revival was to re-establish contact with the complaining witness, Joseph Newton. Detective Harlan traveled to the same modest house in Louisville where Joe had lived since the late 1970s. Upon meeting the father, Harlan found a man who had aged alongside the mystery. Joe was older and quieter, but his narrative had not shifted. He confirmed to the detective that he was still waiting, still living in the home to ensure he could be found, and still willing to cooperate with any renewed legal efforts. This meeting was pivotal. It transformed the case from a collection of old paperwork into an active investigation with a living victim who sought resolution. Empowered by Joe's cooperation and the new, albeit vague, geographic lead, Harlan moved to repair the legal damage caused by the dismissal in the year 2000. He dusted off the original grand jury transcripts from 1985 and worked with prosecutors to rectify the administrative lapse. In 2016, the legal machinery officially turned once again. The warrant for custodial interference was reissued, restoring Deborah Lee Newton's status as a wanted fugitive. This was not merely a symbolic gesture. The reinstatement of the warrant meant that her name would once again be flagged in national crime information centers. If she was stopped for a traffic violation or applied for a job requiring a background check that utilized deeper fingerprinting, the system would now alert authorities. From an analytical perspective, this chapter represents the crucial transition from passive to active investigation. For nearly 15 years, the system had waited for the fugitives to make a mistake. With Detective Harlan's involvement, the strategy shifted. The investigation began to actively hunt again, leveraging the new geographic focus on Florida. The revival of the case also coincided with a massive shift in the technological landscape. Unlike the detectives of the 1980s, who relied on flyers and phone calls, Harlan had access to the dawn of the digital investigative era. He began to prepare for a slow, methodical search that would utilize facial recognition software and cross-reference the old analog clues with modern property records. The file was breathing again, fueled by the persistence of a detective who refused to let the passage of time serve as an excuse for inaction. The vague memory of palm trees had effectively narrowed the search field from the entire United States to a specific region, setting the stage for the digital dragnet that was to come. The breakthrough that would finally unravel the 42-year mystery arrived, not through a grand police raid, but via a quiet, digital transmission. On a humid Tuesday in early May of 2025, a tip was logged through the anonymous Crime Stoppers line in Marion County, Florida. The caller, a woman who steadfastly refused to provide her name, spoke with the precise, practiced tone of someone who had spent hours researching online. She told the dispatcher she had been browsing databases of old missing children cases and had stumbled upon the file of Michelle and Deborah Newton. She had studied the age-progressed image of the mother, created years earlier by forensic artists. Then, she looked at a woman in her own community, a quiet retiree living in the villages named Sharon Neely. The caller noted that the resemblance was uncanny and provided an approximate address in the Fenney neighborhood. Detective Mark Harlan, who had been nurturing the revived case file since 2015, listened to the recording 3 times. In the world of cold cases, look-alike tips are incredibly common and usually lead to dead ends. However, this tip was different. It was specific. It provided a name, Sharon Neely, and a location that aligned with the warm weather lead from a decade prior. Harlan immediately accessed property records and found that a Sharon Neely had purchased a villa in 2011. Crucially, the date of birth listed for Sharon Neely was October 15th, 1960, a date that was remarkably close to, yet distinct from, Deborah's actual birth year of 1959. Harlan contacted detectives in Florida, who quickly secured a recent driver's license photo and images from a community social media page showing Sharon at a neighborhood picnic. When these modern images were run through facial recognition software against the old 1983 photos, the system returned a 92% similarity score. From an analytical standpoint, this moment illustrates the power of crowdsourced justice. The investigation had stalled because law enforcement cannot be everywhere at once. It took a private citizen, armed with curiosity and an internet connection, to make the visual link that algorithms and databases had missed. The digital breadcrumb had finally been found, transforming a ghost back into a person of interest. Armed with the facial recognition results, Detective Harlan flew to Florida the following week. He partnered with Detective Carla Ruiz of the Marion County Sheriff's Office to initiate physical surveillance. The operation was delicate. They were watching a woman who appeared to be a law-abiding grandmother, yet who was suspected of a decades-old felony. For 3 days, they sat in an unmarked car near the quiet cul-de-sac. They watched Sharon Neely walk her small dog and interact with neighbors, observing the way she carried herself, the slope of her shoulders and the tilt of her head, which matched the mannerisms of the missing Deborah Newton. The visual identification was compelling, but in the modern legal system, it was not enough to justify an arrest. They needed biological certainty. The investigation turned to forensic science. Back in Louisville, Harlan approached Deborah's younger sister, Lisa, who had never stopped hoping for a resolution. Lisa voluntarily provided a DNA reference sample, handing over strands of hair she had preserved from a hairbrush used by Deborah in the early 1980s. With this reference sample in hand, investigators obtained a search warrant from a Florida judge to collect a DNA sample from Sharon Neely. When detectives knocked on her door to serve the warrant for a cheek swab, Sharon did not resist. She reportedly looked at the badge and said, "I figured this day would come eventually." She allowed the swab to be taken and then returned to her routine. The samples were rushed to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab. On July 11th, 2025, the results arrived. The report was unequivocal. The probability of a maternal relationship between the sample from Sharon Neely and the reference profile was 99.9997%. This scientific confirmation marked the end of the theoretical phase of the investigation. There was no longer any doubt. Sharon Neely was Deborah Lee Newton. The woman living in the Florida retirement community was the same person who had driven away from Louisville 42 years earlier. For Joe Newton, who received the news via a phone call that afternoon, the confirmation was overwhelming. He simply repeated the phrase, "She's alive," testing the reality of the words. The science had provided the answer that silence had withheld for nearly half a century. The final movement of the police operation took place on the Monday before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 2025. The timing was strategic, but the setting was incongruously peaceful. The Fenny neighborhood in the Villages was quiet, smelling of cut grass and morning coffee. At 9:42 in the morning, Sharon Neely stepped out of her front door, carrying a canvas tote bag, intending to mail holiday cards and buy groceries for a solitary Thanksgiving dinner. She never reached her destination. 2 unmarked cars, which had been waiting at the end of the street, moved in to block the driveway. Deputy Travis Cole approached her, his voice calm but firm, identifying her as Sharon Neely and informing her of the warrant for custodial interference in the first degree. The body camera footage of the arrest captures a reaction that defies the dramatic expectations of a fugitive takedown. Sharon did not run. She did not scream. She simply stopped, looked at the deputy, and admitted her identity. Her composure only cracked slightly when she whispered, "I didn't do anything." A surreal moment occurred when a neighbor, an elderly man watering his plants across the street, called out in a confused, half-joking tone, "They're coming for you, Sharon." He had no idea he was witnessing the resolution of a 42-year-old cold case. To him, she was just the quiet lady who waved when he mowed the lawn. As the handcuffs were applied, Sharon spoke a single sentence that would be replayed on news broadcasts across the country. "I never meant for it to go on this long." This statement offers a window into the psychology of the abductor, the idea that a temporary flight can spiral into a lifetime of evasion. She was transported to the county jail, booked, and held on a $50,000 bond. The art of disappearing had finally failed, dismantled by the persistence of a father and the inevitable reach of modern forensics. While the arrest of the mother closed one chapter of the legal case, a far more delicate and traumatic event was unfolding 30 minutes away in the town of Ocala. Investigators had located the daughter, now a 46-year-old woman living under the legal name Alexis Marie Carter. She worked as a veterinary technician and lived a quiet, private life, completely unaware that she was a missing person. A social worker named Elena Morales, trained in trauma, informed notification, knocked on her door that same morning. When Michelle, known to herself only as Alexis, opened the door in her scrubs, she was presented with a reality that shattered her entire autobiography. Morales sat her down and gently laid out 3 photographs: the toddler in the sailor dress, the age-progressed sketch, and her own driver's license photo. "You are Michelle Marie Newton," Morales told her. "Your biological father, Joseph Newton, is still alive. He's been looking for you since the day you disappeared." The impact of this revelation is difficult to quantify. Psychologists refer to this as identity dissolution. In an instant, the story Michelle had been told her entire life, that her father had died when she was a baby, was revealed to be a lie constructed to cover a felony. She did not cry immediately. She went into a state of shock, her breathing becoming shallow as she touched the photo of the toddler, as if it belonged to a stranger. Her first questions were not about the crime, but about the connection. "Does he know?" she asked. And then, "Can I meet him?" In that living room, surrounded by photos of her dogs, the woman formerly known as Alexis began the painful process of reconciling the mother she loved with the kidnapper who had stolen her from a father she never knew she had. The physical reunion was deemed too overwhelming to happen immediately, so the first contact was arranged via telephone for the following afternoon. On Wednesday, November 26th, Joe Newton sat in his living room in Louisville, staring at the phone. 2,000 miles away, Michelle sat in her apartment with the social worker. When the phone rang, Joe answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was hesitant, soft, and completely unfamiliar, yet it belonged to his daughter. "Hi, this is Michelle," she said. For Joe, hearing that voice was the culmination of 42 years of silence. He reportedly told her, "I've waited so long to hear your voice." The conversation that followed was remarkable for its lack of anger. They did not discuss the indictment or the years of deception. Instead, they built a bridge using the small, mundane details of their lives. Michelle talked about her work with animals. Joe described the oak tree in the front yard that was still standing. When Joe mentioned that he had kept her room exactly as she left it, Michelle laughed, a small, surprised sound, and joked that she hoped the stuffed animals weren't too dusty. It was a moment of profound human connection, proving that while the years had been stolen, the bond remained. By the end of the 47-minute call, both were weeping. It was the first step in a long journey of healing, a reconnection without accusation that prioritized the future over the past. Thanksgiving Day, November 27th, 2025, was overcast in Louisville. For the first time in 4 decades, Joe Newton set the table for 2. He cooked the traditional meal he had made alone for so many years. But this time, the anticipation was not for a memory, but for a guest. Michelle flew in that afternoon, escorted by Detective Harlan. She requested no media presence, wanting the moment to be hers alone. When the car pulled up to the quiet street, she stood on the sidewalk for a long minute, looking at the house she had no memory of, yet which held her history. She walked up the driveway and knocked. When Joe opened the door, there were no words initially. They simply looked at one another, A father aged by grief, and a daughter grown into a woman he barely recognized yet intimately knew. They embraced, holding on tightly as if to anchor themselves against the lost time. Joe whispered, "You're home," and Michelle replied, "I didn't know I was missing." The complexities of the situation remained. The following day, Michelle and Joe sat side by side in a courtroom gallery to watch Deborah's arraignment via video link. It was a visual representation of the divided loyalty Michelle now faced, the mother in an orange jumpsuit who had raised her, and the father holding her hand who had been wronged. In a statement to the press, Michelle displayed incredible grace, saying, "I'm not choosing sides. I'm just trying to understand." As of early 2026, the criminal case against Deborah remains pending, but the true resolution has already occurred in that living room in Louisville. Michelle has begun the process of legally changing her name back to Michelle Marie Newton Carter, bridging her two identities. The photograph on the mantle is no longer a frozen relic of a missing child. It is the origin story of a woman who has finally found her way back. The case of Michelle Newton serves as a powerful reminder that cold does not mean closed. It stands as a testament to the power of forensic science, the importance of public tips, and above all, the enduring, stubborn hope of a parent who refused to let the silence have the last word. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the archives of the forgotten. If this story has moved you, or if you believe in the importance of keeping these cold cases in the light, please consider engaging with our community. There are thousands of families still waiting for that one phone call, that one tip that breaks the silence. Until next time, keep looking and never stop listening.